Hey there! Welcome back to 31 Days of Horror, and we are on day 26. We're getting to the end of the month here. And for day 26, I checked out yet another PG-13 horror film, and this one is also a Netflix original. So 2 days in a row we've gotten those. And today was Mr. Harrigan's Phone. Which is a short story by Stephen King that has been adapted for film. And it originally appeared in an anthology novel called If It Bleeds. And coincidentally enough, this film, Mr. Harrigan's Phone, was made, I believe, in 2023. May have come out in 2024. Another short story in that same anthology called The Life of Chuck also was recently adapted for film by Mike Flanagan. And I believe they just premiered it at the Cannes Film Festival about a month or two ago. I'm not entirely sure, but I remember seeing some fanfare about that, and it stars Tom Hiddleston. So I was really interested to kind of check out this movie because I've mentioned it before. You know, I watched Salem's Lot earlier in the month. I am a Stephen King fan. I'm a big Stephen King book fan. I have to be in the right mood to read his stuff. It's pretty specific. You have to be a fan of a certain type of writing in order to, I think, read his work. But he tells wonderful stories, regardless of whether or not you're a fan of his writing style. And I've been a fan since I was a kid. I think almost everybody from my generation who's into any sort of horror movies or who has irrational fears of anything, most likely at some point in their childhood read a Stephen King book way too early. I believe mine was Needful Things in about 5th grade. So anyway, this is a Stephen King story, and we've talked a little bit before about how Stephen King does a fantastic job writing kids, and that a lot of times that puts stories in an awkward sort of purgatory because the stories he writes are very much mature and they're for adults, but they center around children, and it's very difficult to make an adult movie that stars children because those two things contradict each other, and people tend to be very uncomfortable having children cast in a movie that includes very adult themes. And horror usually includes very adult themes. And most of the time, when horror films include children, terrible things happen to children. And I don't think that's something that anybody's really happy about. But Stephen King has this amazing way of writing kids in very believable ways, truly believable. Not like, oh, aren't they cute? Oh, aren't they sweet? It's no, those are believable kids. They try out swearing. They look at magazines they shouldn't be looking at. I just referenced reading Needful Things by Stephen King when I was in the 5th grade, and I know plenty of other people who can name off the top of their head what is the Stephen King book they read well before they should have. And I think it's kind of interesting to look at a lot of those dynamics of how they make Stephen King stories, especially when they contain a big element of storyline with kids. And the main child in this movie, he starts off as a younger boy, he gets older, and when he's older, he's played by Jaden Martell, who you may recognize actually from It Chapter 1 and a little bit of It Chapter 2 when they did the flashbacks. He plays one of the kids in the movie very prominently. And he was wonderful at it then. And so he's very familiar with playing a Stephen King kid, of kind of embodying that childhood innocence with also that childhood truth of kids are people who are just trying to learn how to be people. And when they're presented with really terrible, horrible things, the way that their minds resolve those things is very different than the way adults do, because it's coming from a place of innocence. It's coming from a place of not being jaded by the world and of having these ideas of possibility that a lot of adults don't have. And that really characterizes Stephen King's stories in a way that I don't find other writers to capture very well. Even writers who do write children very well. I mean, I've said it before. I think I've said it in other videos, and I've said it to other people when I've been talking about Stephen King's books or his film adaptations. The biggest thing that I take away from those is when a filmmaker is making a Stephen King story, what do they do with the kid parts? Are they true to the kid parts? Do they focus on those? Do they realize the kids are kind of the stars of the show and the adults are set pieces in a lot of ways? And there are some directors that seem to get that, and then there are other directors that don't. And I have to say, I'm very impressed with this movie. It is a Netflix original, and it doesn't have the Flanagan feel. It doesn't necessarily have the same childhood, innocent feel that a lot of other Stephen King adaptations do that makes them successful, but this does allow for the child in the story, his name is Greg, to kind of be the centerpiece of this film. And that's significant. The story itself is about a young boy who is hired by an elderly billionaire to read to him. He's an older man. He is scholarly. He's very well read. He's a very successful businessman, but his eyes are going and he loves literature, but he's not able to read for long periods of time. So he hires a kid for $5 an hour to read books to him. And these books were well beyond Greg's years when he started reading to Mr. Harrigan. But as time goes on and we see Greg grow into the character played by Jaden Martell, we see his reading improve. We see his analysis of literature improve and his love of literature kind of flourish in a subtle way, but also we see this beautiful relationship that he has with this Mr. Harrigan kind of unfold. And is it like a beautiful, like grandson, grandfather kind of relationship? No. Mr. Harrigan can be very cold. He can be blunt. He can not necessarily be cruel, but you can tell he has an underlying cruelty that is possible. And this is conveyed brilliantly by the unfortunately late Donald Sutherland. I'm not positive if this was his last film credit or not, but sadly he did pass away in June of 2024. And he is a dynamic face and voice of so many things throughout our history with horror and film. And I think that we lost one of the great ones because he's given us so many performances that are believable, that are genuine, that are compelling. And this one goes along right with it. And this elderly billionaire, who's a kind of a curmudgeonly old man, develops an affection for this boy. And I think that it's handled very nicely. It's definitely conveyed very well through the passage of time and through subtle conversations and through an honesty that they have together. And this is interesting because now we're a good distant deal into this video, and I've yet to talk about it as a horror film. And that's because a big part of this movie is developing that relationship. And part of the relationship is this older man encouraging this boy to stand up for himself to his bullies, to go after his success, to not let other things hold him back, and has encouraged him in a lot of positive ways. And at the same time, Greg also learns from other people, like in the town and from doing his own research, that this man is not a beloved man. He is a billionaire in the traditional sense of he's had to do a lot of cutthroat things in order to be successful. He's had to justify a lot of behaviors that the rest of us don't necessarily justify in order to make his billions. And I think that's something that we find when you look into the backgrounds of a lot of people who are billionaires, is they're willing to make decisions that the rest of us are not necessarily willing to compromise our morals to make, to be successful or to make money. And, that's a theme that comes up in a lot of literature in a lot of movies, especially lately, because we're having a lot of weird world and economic issues. And I don't think right now in this video is the time and place to really discuss that, but that does come up. That is it's a very prominent um, part of the movie because it paints a lot of Greg's confusion in his um, kind of softness for this man that he's been able to form a relationship with, a friendship with, just from reading to him and discussing literature with him and spending a few days a week just having, very cordial or kind conversations with this man. And that is his personal experience with this man. But the flip side of that is people's experience with him, not as one of his friends, is of that of a villain. And that's an interesting aspect to kind of explore that we don't necessarily see a lot, unfortunately, in stories. I think it would be a kind of cool thing to explore in more aspects of stories. But the reason that I bring any of that up, the reason I give you all that backstory on this particular film, and the reason that I find it to be important is because all of that leads to this boy, as a kind gesture to this man who's been very kind to him, he buys him a cell phone. And the movie is actually set in 2003, so it's when the first iPhones were being released, so it was kind of like this kid got the iPhone, he's very excited about it, and then he kind of wants to pay it forward and do something nice for this man that's done some nice things for him. So he buys him an iPhone and he starts teaching him how to use a smartphone. So he has this very elderly man who subscribes to the Wall Street Journal to get his business finance news, and then Greg shows him like, no, you just click this app and it shows you stocks in real time. Maybe it's 1 or 2 minutes different, but so he shows him that. He shows him you have access to news and all of those things. And there's a very poignant part in the movie where Mr. Harrigan essentially predicts everything that's going to end up happening because of the internet. And it's a very meta moment, especially as we're realizing that we're watching this movie on streaming, and streaming is a significant part of the internet, and it's one of the ways that they get our money. You have to pay for the internet to then pay for the service to then stream the movies to have the entertainment. And it's just cable with way more steps anymore. So then there's commentary on that there, and that's pretty significant. And as old people in films tend to do, Mr. Harrigan passes away. And that's when the horror aspect of the film comes in, and Greg finds that when he uses his iPhone to call or text Mr. Harrigan's phone, he can call him and he just kind of talks when he needs to talk through things. He kind of talks to Mr. Harrigan, and he finds that very therapeutic, in dealing with the death of somebody that he cares about. And he sends him text messages, but then he starts getting text messages back, and they seem a little bit cryptic. He kind of freaks out. He does tell people, which is actually great in horror, because how many people in horror are like, oh, I've been getting these really weird text messages where some guy says he's gonna murder me. And he's just joking around. It's just some guy, and then it's like, no, really, this guy's good, But meanwhile, he's like, no, Dad, I'm getting these texts. They're from Mr. Harrigan. He's dead. He can't, It's cool that he asked for help. That's cool to see people kind of doing that in horror. And, it gets dismissed because it can be explained. Oh, his phone got cloned. Somebody's messing with you. And then through a series of events, the movie essentially at this point then becomes Death Note, where he kind of asks for Mr. Harrigan's help and people start showing up dead. Unfortunately, much like this video, the movie spends so much time developing their relationship that by the time we get to the horror aspect of this film, I've kind of forgotten it's a horror film. And I haven't read the short story myself, but I'm very familiar with Stephen King's work, and I kind of feel like in much less space and time, Stephen King developed that relationship between Mr. Harrigan and Greg. And in order to pad the runtime of making a short film into a feature length, or short story into a feature length film, I think they may have tried to kind of pad the runtime a little bit by adding more elements to the beginning. And then the horror elements lacked a little bit. That being said, I actually think that this would be a great movie for the younger side of the PG-13 crowd. When you have, the 11, 12-year-olds who are just kind of getting into the spooky story kind of part of life, I think you need films like this where it spends a lot of time on exposition. There's not a ton of scares because it kind of eases you into it. And it's certainly not a bad movie. It does tell a cool story. But it's also not the most original. And when you kind of start getting into commentary on cell phones and young people and the internet and things like that, unfortunately, there's only so many stories you can tell. And most of them boil down to phone bad. And every generation with new technology, I think, has those kinds of stories. They become more prominent. They become cautionary tales. And that's kind of why they come up in horror, is because there's meant to be cautionary tales in some senses of like, Halloween 3 is a good example of everybody getting excited to watch, the Halloween horror special, but the evil company has made these masks that make everybody die who watches this stuff, and it triggers a noise and all of these things. That's TV bad. And from the previous generation, TV was the thing that was bad. That's the thing that's going to rot your brain. Before that, I'm sure it was magazines, newspapers, books, any pieces of new technology that enable people, newer, different people, to get information they may not have had access to previously, tends to really garner this new technology is bad and is terrible and is going to destroy the world. Although I do think possibly in this case, the internet might actually destroy the world. But given the current state of things, I don't necessarily know that would be a bad thing. But anyway, and it's kind of where it lost me because I've been there. It was computers, it was phones, it was every time a new technology comes out, it's going to rot your brain, it's going to ruin your life. And then we find a way to fix it. And it becomes old news, and it becomes something that we just use as a utility, and then we move on. And then the next thing that comes out is going to be the thing that ruins the world. Currently, it's AI. I think after that, it's probably going to be robotics, since that's getting a little more developed. But currently, I think we're on cell phones and the internet. This movie is good. I don't really have a ton of criticisms other than it's not the most original story, but I do think that, like I said, if you have like 11, 12-year-olds in older who just kind of want something a little spooky, something to watch the Halloween season, I definitely don't think this is bad. Has great acting all around, wonderful performance, like I said, from Donald Sutherland. I've never been unhappy with any of his performances. They're always phenomenal. Jaden Martell did wonderful, and he played beautifully alongside Donald Sutherland, and that is not something easy to do. I mean, you have a man who was 90 or going to be 90 alongside a kid who's in his teens, I'm guessing, maybe his early 20s, it's hard to tell. And that they can play so well together and play off of each other so well, believably, I think is really cool. Like I said, I'll probably say the same thing that I said yesterday. It's a shame that this movie is probably going to get lost in the shuffle on Netflix. I don't know that a whole lot of people have checked it out. I haven't heard anybody talking about it. But if you've seen it, or if now you're interested in checking it out, I would love to hear your thoughts down below. So far, I think I have one comment on my Casper video. I would love to hear more. I want to hear from you guys too, because right now I'm just talking to myself. So, tomorrow we are on day 27, and we're getting close to the big day. So if you have any recommendations for videos to do after our 31 days are up, just leave them in comments down below, and I'm looking at, maybe putting together a few more series, or maybe I just won't make any more videos. I'm not really sure. It's all just vibes from here on. So I'll see you tomorrow. Have a great day.